So to begin, I just want to say that my talk will be a bit theoretical, so like please bear with me. So my talk is titled on LGBTQ targeting affirmative action, and so I'm gonna go through the technical terms first, okay? So L stands for lesbian, G stands for gay, B stands for bisexual, T stands for transgender or trans, and Q stands for queer or queer or genderqueer. Um, in my talk, I will use the word queer and LGBTQ interchangeably. So I figured that my talk will be quite different from other talks today because so far the talks have focused mostly on how the individual can break the limitations and boundaries. I want to gravitate towards something of a grander scope, which is policy. So by a show of hands, please raise your hand if you know what the term affirmative action means. Affirmative action. All right, so don't know, like, if you don't know it, it's fine, don't worry, I'm gonna explain it a bit later. So, yeah, affirmative action. So in 2016, I co-founded an NGO called Sex Big Organization, which to the best of my knowledge was the first student-run NGO dedicated to sex ed in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. And at 16, I was overly ambitious, and I was very angry. I was angry that I was bullied by people in middle school. I was angry that my teachers did nothing to stop the bullies. I was angry that there's no solid sex education in Vietnam where you can tell kids that being gay is not a disease and being trans is not a disorder. So at 16, I took matters into my own hands and established a full-fledged NGO while still being a high school student full-time. So if I had been invited to give a talk back then, I would have been talking about something completely different, which is about how young people are on our own, which is quite traumatic because I was quite a radical back then. Fast forward 6 years later, I got a chance to move abroad, and I realized how wrong I was for assuming extraordinary independence in every young marginalized person, and for assuming that there's no such thing as a top-down social change. I've realized that there are many adults and many systems that do feel and should feel an obligation to provide remedies to those who are discriminated against via something called affirmative action. So what is affirmative action? So in this talk, I will rely on the definition provided by the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Affirmative action means positive steps taken to increase the diversity or the representation of women and minorities in areas of education, employment, and culture from which they have been historically excluded. So there are many. So like when you say that you don't know what it means, I figure that it might be because you don't know the term in English, or you are not familiar with how it is conceptualized in academia. Essentially, the most relevant policy in Vietnam I can think of is chính sách ưu tiên in the country's national college entry exam, where the government gives additional points to students from backgrounds that they deem to be worthy of additional benefits or uplifting support, such as ethnic minorities, injured veterans, or children of veterans. Now, additional points in a college entry exam is just one example of the many forms of affirmative action. Studying abroad, I've had a chance to see an entirely new landscape of how we can think of and approach these kind of policies, and for queer people who are looking for a job or an internship, these three things are most common: LGBTQ tailored recruitment, scholarships and awards, and educational programs or conferences. So supporters of affirmative action tend to usually rely on 4 lines of reasoning. Firstly, they might argue that queer youth don't know about these resources and these opportunities and these job postings. So a proposed solution would be to run and organize outreach campaigns and marketing events to give these people a chance to know about these resources. This is perhaps the most easily defensible approach in affirmative action. Secondly, you might argue that queer youth are unable to obtain the same resources and opportunities to be competitive in the job market compared to non-queer people. So therefore, a proposed solution would be to run educational programs and conferences in which you provide insights and knowledge and skills to these people, and also to help them create a network of like-minded youth. Thirdly, people might suggest that queer people are unable to to get the same kind of opportunities because they are discriminated against in the job market. A proposed solution is to run something called preferential programs where you reserve slots or seats for these applicants to these companies. And last but not least, some might just simply say that diversity is good. Good here is as vague as it can get. Some recruiters might just have a moral compass guiding them that hiring queer people is a good thing. Some might argue that that hiring queer people brings fresh perspectives and experiences into the workplace or a classroom, which eventually increases the quality of work overall. I personally support affirmative action because I believe in its benefits. But there's also something that I also want to highlight, which is that Vietnam currently has little to none programs where you can prioritize, support, or encourage queer people. This is rather unfortunate because Vietnam is considerably much more progressive than Southeast Asia at large. For example, in 2013, Vietnam decriminalized homosexuality by decriminalizing same-sex wedding ceremonies. Vietnam also has something called quyền được chuyển đổi giới tính, which means the right for one to change one's gender. That is very progressive compared to the rest of the world. But the specifics of the law still remain quite unclear to this date, which is quite unfortunate. But there are grounds for me to be optimistic towards the steps that we will take of our country towards equality. Events like this are very exciting to me, where we have some of the brightest, most curious young minds of our country gathered in one place, and I hope that the right discussions will start to take place. So we've been talking about affirmative action. How should it be designed? So I have a proposal, which is something I would like to call multi-categorical affirmative action. I believe that our approach to AA, for short for affirmative action, our approach to AA needs to be more intersectional. What this means is that I think we should not only consider sexual orientation or gender identity in these programs. We should also start thinking about categories that are potentially meaningful to one's suffering and one's privilege, such as class, race, and ethnicity. So, I've had my fair share of experiencing and observing these programs, and I've noticed a trend in which many upper class people and upper middle class people enjoy the benefits of these programs, and as a first income and as a first gen low income person, this is quite unfortunate because these resources merely and simply shift my attention from my queerness to my being poor. So let's start first with an example of my proposal. So imagine you are a recruiter and you have one slot left, and you have to choose between two equally qualified candidates, between a first-gen queer person and a non-first-gen queer person. First-gen here means the first person in the family to go to college. I would propose to choose the first one over the second one because you should consider more categories beyond just one category, which is queerness. Secondly, choosing between a black, low-income, lesbian, cisgender woman versus a white, upper-class, gay, cisgender man. Cisgender here means personal identity and gender matches with one's sex at birth, which essentially means non-trans. I would propose us to choose the first one over the second one because the first one, let's say, it's quite simple actually, because a white person is more privileged than a black person, upper class is more privileged than low income, and man is privileged more than woman. So therefore, I would propose something that allows us to simultaneously take into account multiple categories while still engaging critically with the queerness of our applicants and the people who might need support. Again, so this is gonna be a bit more complicated and more ambiguous. So let's compare between a black, upper class, lesbian, cisgender woman and a white, low income, gay, cisgender man. While the second one is low income, he is still a white man who is considerably much more progressed, much more privileged than a black woman. However, it gets much more complicated now. Let's compare between a black, upper class, gay, cisgender man and a white, low income, lesbian, cisgender woman. Well, if we take into account the context of the US, some might argue that race is a dictating category, and therefore the first one should still be prioritized over the second one. However, in my framework and in my proposal, I propose that the second case should be prioritized because she belongs to more marginalized groups than the first one. So what's happening here is that the debate starts to become a treacherous ground of marking one's suffering and one's privilege based on dichotomous categories. The dilemma now here is that if you want to create a program of preferentialism, if you don't make it intersectional, you risk creating a program that overuses blanket preference, and therefore it might become counterproductive. However, once you make it intersectional, you risk overlooking possibly meaningful categories, or you might starting to rank marginalization, just like the example I showed you earlier. I think I might have time limit right now, so let's end with a final exercise, which is quite a brain and tongue twist. So let's compare between a black upper class first-gen lesbian cisgender woman with no disability versus a white Hispanic low-income but host parents went to college and heterosexual trans woman with a visual impairment. I would propose us to choose. So like my proposal is to count marginalization and not rank. I will explain it with this. So for the first case, you can count. We can intuitively count the marginalized group based on which identity category. For example, the first case you have the black for race, first gen for first gen status, and woman for gender identity. Second case, you have Hispanic for ethnicity, low income for class, trans woman for gender identity, and visual impairment for disability. So therefore, the second case has 4 marginalized counts, and the first case has 3. So therefore, I would propose us to choose the second case over the first case, simply because it allows us a chance to have a systemic way of viewing these applications without biasing ourselves with ranking marginalization. So this essentially encapsulates my idea of how we can do this. So I presume that people who apply to these programs are queer people, right? So being queer is the prerequisites. So once the applications are all in, the application readers should do first is to count the number of additional marginalized identities each person belongs to. Once the counting is done, applicants are sorted into groups in which people in the same group share the same amount of marginalized identities as that person. This allows us a chance to engage critically with queerness and beyond. So the reading process, we start first. So we will select candidates from the group with infinite marginalized identities, and then moving down to n-1 until when we finish with the ones with 0 additional marginalized identities. And therefore, this case that I just used earlier would not happen again, simply because the second case and the first case would not be put in the same group because they have different amount of additional marginalized identities. Well, what I have proposed today is not the ultimate solution, because I know that it has flaws in itself. But my goal today is not to prescribe a policy solution, but to perhaps provoke a discussion among us about AA, but also to invite you to think critically about how we can make these programs effective and not just there. We have to make it work for everyone, regardless of their multiple marginalization and identities. And thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much.